Joining us now is Professor Mohamad Junaid. He's a professor of anthropology at Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts. Junaid, as you've asked me to call you, Professor, as I'm tempted to call you, how are you? Thanks for being here.
Hi, Michael. It's a pleasure to be with Majority Report.
So, can you start by just giving us a fresh we've talked about it on the show, but give us a re-review as to what has happened in Kashmir over the last several months from the government in Delhi.
So for those listeners who don't know Kashmir so well, just wanted to let you know that Kashmir is at the heart of three major countries. All of them have nuclear weapons: India, Pakistan, and China. It's a Himalayan region with a long history, and it became part of this dispute between India and Pakistan in 1947 when the British left the subcontinent, leaving Kashmiris in a state of limbo because they were not allowed to decide their future, whether they would go with India, Pakistan, or whether they would prefer to remain independent. So in the aftermath of the partition in 1947, India signed this treaty with the ruler of Kashmir, who was not a representative figure for Kashmiris. It's called the Instrument of Accession. And based on that treaty, India had incorporated two key articles in its constitution, Article 370 and Article 35A, which became a constitutional kind of link between India and Kashmir. Article 370 was about Kashmir's autonomy, that most of Kashmir's, the decisions that affect Kashmir would be taken by assembly in Kashmir, except for defense, communication, and external affairs. And Article 35A was about land and permanent residency, who could live in Kashmir, who could buy land, immovable property in Kashmir. And then this system has continued for 7 decades almost in a little watered down form. But on August 5, 2019, Indian government withdrew and revoked Article 370 without consulting Kashmir and Kashmiris, and also revoked 35A. All of this was done by what Kashmiris perceive as deceit, because most of Kashmir was put under a severe lockdown. People's phones were taken away. They could not call anyone. They could not connect with anyone. The internet was shut down. So right now we are like 4 months into it, and that process has continued. Kashmiris have not been able to kind of express their opinion on what has happened with these articles.
And what, in terms of how you understand the government in Delhi's move, and you talked about the land issue, obviously there is sort of the Hindutva dimension, and I'd like you to talk about the ideology of Narendra Modi and the BJP government. But is there also something going on here that maybe bear with me if the analogies aren't perfect, but something that's almost more analogous in some respects to something like Puerto Rico, or another kind of like that there's an opportunity to also do a lot of very primitive capital accumulation right now. You can get people off of pretty prime real estate, some of the most beautiful places in the world. I haven't had the privilege of going, but at least even just kind of on a as I've seen it represented in film and photography, there's ski slopes, there's money to be made, capital to be accumulated. And in the clips of sort of Indian sort of mainstream right-wing media that I've seen, there's there's the sort of stuff you expect with the BJP, Hindutva stuff and terrorism rhetoric and so on. But I've also seen clips that are like, this is going to be a bonanza. There's great money-making opportunities here. So what's the sort of relationship of what's happening here between a kind of broader nationalist project and consolidation and the identity politics of it and the capital accumulation dimension?
So we are living in a moment when crony capitalism has met this nativist kind of populist nationalism. And it's happening in a variety of spaces across the globe. India is a particularly a potent case for this because it's the lives of 1.23 billion people that are at stake. Now, let me just like break it down a little bit. The RSS, which is currently the regime that runs India, Narendra Modi, who's the prime minister, although his party is called BJP, but BJP is just a political front for RSS. Modi himself is a lifelong member of RSS. RSS has its roots in 1920s. It emerged as a sort of a nationalist organization taking inspiration from the rise of Nazism in Germany and fascism in Italy. It believed in Hindu supremacist ideas. It believed in eugenics, and believed that nationalism trumped every other consideration. So being Indian is primary over being human. So this is the party that kind of assassinated a member of it. This party assassinated Gandhi, and they were kind of low-lying for a pretty long time, although their ideas kind of were dispersed across the Indian political sphere. But in the 90s, early 90s, when India was going this massive restructuring of its economy, where these IMF prescribed restructuration policies, taking away benefits from people, ending the public distribution system, selling off the national assets to domestic capitalists. All of this kind of coalesced together at that time, and the nationalists supported this domestic accumulation in the hands of few people like Ambanis, the Adanis, the Birlas and Tatas, who were these big industrial houses in India, and these big capitalists kind of like used this nativist hyper-nationalist discourse to get rid of some of these democratic debates, democratic institutions, trying to persuade people away from questions of inequality and economy towards fear-mongering, towards creating internal threat. And so all of this has led to a situation where in India, which is probably one of the among the two top most unequal societies in the world, where the top 1% of the population owns basically 75% of the national wealth, where almost three-quarters of wealth generated in the economy goes to the top 10% of the people. And, so this inequality has kind of coexisted and allowed this nativist rhetoric to go on. Now, with the revocation of 370 and 35A, the Indian government, led by BJP and Modi, wants to do two things in Kashmir. One, it wants to demographically change the region by bringing in Indian people who can, like, basically do, come in, turn Kashmiris into a minority, and remove through demographic transformation the question of self-determination, which still remains to be, addressed. A historic demand from Kashmiris. And second, and most potently, they want to sell off Kashmir, the pristine lands of Kashmir, which is ecologically very fragile, to these crony capitalists who have been supporting them, who have been funding their elections. So all of that process has already begun.
And so actually, so maybe it's also kind of like, in some ways, analogous to Tibet, in terms of the kind of occupation and population engineering, and also a huge amount of ecological resources to be determined, so to be acquired. Let's come back to India in a minute. Let's talk about the other two players here, and let's start with Pakistan. I want to basically just balance. I mean, there's no doubt that obviously the sort of RSS propaganda and the main sort of perspective of justifying this behavior in terms of an international press and people who defend it, they just sort of repeat terrorism talking points. Now, and so, that's important. I know you'll push back and debunk it. At the same time, I mean, obviously Pakistan has actually funded some of these types of groups, even independently of Kashmir, going back to like the attack on the Oberoi Hotel in 2008. great atrocity. And, India and Pakistan have their own dynamic, which in some ways it seems like Pakistan maybe, has an even more kind of limited foreign policy in terms of its focus really specifically on India. So what is Pakistan's role here, both in terms of what part of Kashmir is in Pakistan and is the human rights situation on the Pakistani side better than on the Indian side, or worse, or equal? And to what extent has there been, not in the current escalation, I mean, the politics of that is obvious in terms of what's coming out of the nationalist crony politics of Delhi right now, but historically, have some of the groups and some of the things that Pakistan has funded, have they engaged in atrocities?
Yes. So let me first begin by saying that as a scholar of Kashmir, I don't see Kashmir necessarily as a territorial dispute between India and Pakistan. Mm-hmm. Although globally, the discourse on Kashmir has been basically captured by India and Pakistan. Pakistan claims it to be the unfinished business of partition, and India blames Pakistan for all that is happening in Kashmir. So what Kashmiris have been trying to do from last 70 years is to center themselves and claim that Kashmir belongs to Kashmiris, and Kashmiris should be the people who decide their fate and their future. Now, of course, 1947, part of Kashmir came under Pakistani control, which meant that Pakistan became kind of like a party to this question. And there are a lot of regions of Kashmir that are under Pakistani control right now. So since 1947, India and Pakistan have fought several wars, and most of these wars have taken place over Kashmiri territory, affecting Kashmiris the most. It's the Kashmiris who die in these wars. In 1990, Kashmiris rose up in a rebellion against the Indian control in mass protests, which were brutally suppressed. They were massacred. There's a litany of massacres, really, from 1988 to 1990 that took place in Kashmir at that time, in response to which young Kashmiri activists crossed over the line of control and went to the other side of Kashmir seeking arms training. While the Pakistani government at that time showed lukewarm response to this, they lightly armed them, gave them 15 days training and sent them back. Most of these young Kashmiris kind of basically died as soon as they came in. Thousands of Kashmiri militants who had basically barely any training were dying. Right. And you have to remember, it is a time also when the Afghan situation is boiling over. The Soviet Union left Afghanistan, and there's a war going on between Najibullah's regime and the so-called Mujahideen, who actually win, and many of these militants are then transported into Kashmir by the Pakistani establishment. And the Pakistani establishment basically sought to create a constituency in Kashmir where the militants the only ones who had some power would be the ones who would speak the pro-Pakistan language, like that Kashmir should merge with Pakistan. And those Kashmiris, the majority who wanted to be independent and were fighting India for that, were slowly silenced, of course, by Indian repression, but also by Pakistani manipulation. Yes, many of these groups that came into Kashmir were Islamist. They were some of them believed in jihad, some of them even believed in global jihad. But the overall sentiment in Kashmir has been centered on Kashmir. Kashmiris are a pluralistic people. We have a long history of being a plural society with tolerating differences and a very progressive past. And in fact, in 1940s, one of the major events was this adoption of this constitution called, not a constitution, but a document called Naya Kashmir, which imagined a progressive, free, democratic, pluralistic Kashmir. That sentiment has remained, and it's at the heart of the Kashmiri struggle for self-determination. Because most Kashmiris believe, of course, that India and Pakistan have not been able to be fair and just to Kashmiris, and India has, of course, failed as an idea for Kashmir. So the only best solution is to basically, chart one's own course and build a society, a pluralistic society that Kashmir deserves.
So, yeah, and this is really important. I just want to underline this. So, I mean, yeah, so international rhetoric and security rhetoric is India versus Pakistan. What is the Indian record there? Does India deserve it? What are the notions of nationhood in India? How does it relate to Kashmir? Then in Pakistan takes, independent actors who want independence and actual autonomy for Kashmir, and then obviously weaponize it for their own nationalistic foreign policy aims. And missed inside all of that is this ongoing reality that Kashmir really is an independent thing with its own autonomous direction and desire, which is suppressed by these two nationalist impulses.
Yeah.
Okay. What is China's role in all of this?
So China's role, first of all, of course, it's as I said, it's a neighboring country. Its borders meet Kashmir through Tibet, which it occupied in the 50s. And part of the historic territory of what was the state of Jammu and Kashmir before 1947 was taken over by China in 1962 during India-China War. So China has territorial control over part of Kashmir, part of this historic state of Kashmir. China is also an ally of Pakistan, although much of that alliance is built on issuing statements, but not actually being a force on the ground. While it has not provided to be kind of like a stabilizing force in the region, and kind of has strong trade relations with India, although it has strong defense relations with Pakistan. So its role is kind of ambiguous and has not factored in the Kashmir question as one would have imagined.
So back to India, there's another notion which sort of connects what's happened in Kashmir with a broader question about the nature of Indian nationhood. And I want you to clarify, I guess, first of all, that even before this significant escalation by the Modi government, that Kashmir was already a place with decades-long significant human rights violations by the Indian government. But also, is there something to the notion that for all of the imperfections and all of the contradictions in any number of areas, there state of emergency in the 1970s, pogroms against Sikhs in the 1980s, the occupation of Kashmir, that there still is this notion of Indian pluralism coming from Nehru that it, again, at least allows for some of this notion of autonomy in Kashmir. And now in this new state-building project of the RSS, that India is being reconfigured along anti-pluralist, nationalist lines, and that this is a sort of, it's a second founding in a way, and Kashmir is ground zero for that.
So when you look at Kashmir from, or India or the Nehruvian project from the perspective of Kashmir, from its margins, there is really not that much of a difference. The question of plebiscite or referendum was actually taken by in India itself. International leaders at that time had told Kashmiris that they will hold a plebiscite so that Kashmiris can determine their future. And the betrayal of those promises, as Kashmiris call it, begin almost with Nehru himself. In 1953, for instance, he arrested Sheikh Abdullah, who had endorsed the instrument of accession, and kept him in jail for almost a decade and a half, and introduced legislation through these things called presidential orders that gradually took away the content of the Article 370. So Nehruvian policies from the beginning, while they were pluralistic, almost like, that there was a notion of secular nation building, they were carried out in many parts of India. But you have to also understand that India these national leaders inherited an empire from the British, and they wanted to turn it into a nation state. And Nehru used the same kinds of colonial policies that the British had used in the subcontinent. I mean, if you look at India from the very beginning, it has been at persistent war with different communities, nationalities, nations, groups, and religious minorities from the very beginning. From the bombings in Mizoram, the Armed Forces Special Powers Act in Manipur in the early 50s, to war in Kashmir and arrests of Kashmiri national leaders, to the so-called police action, which was military brutality in Hyderabad, to annexation of Goa, and all of these things have been kind of like continuously taking place. We have argued for a long time that Congress kind of set the template that Hindu nationalism almost, basically adopted.
The Congress Party, just for people.
Yeah, the Congress Party. The Congress Party set up that template, and although the rhetoric was secular, the rhetoric was national, where minorities were supposed to be included in different degrees. The Hindu nationalism basically used the same template of imperial control, except that they were going to give primacy to the interests of one community. That's the Hindus.
Right.
Yeah.
So now is the sort of where do we go from here question. I think, for an American and a global audience, there is the sort of way of trying to grip people's attention on this, which is, there's so much worry about North Korea, but in fact, like the conflict between India and Pakistan, and God forbid if China got involved, that this could lead to maybe the most dangerous hot war on the planet. And then there's the other notion of really centering Kashmiri aspiration. So from those two frames, what do you see playing out? And then, in fact, even what do you think is helpful? Was the Bernie Sanders statement, at least in terms of the clarity on Article 3, was that helpful? Where do we sort of go from here in terms of the big kind of global threat level and then the urgent level of Kashmiri protection and self-determination?
Yes. So I think that it's a question of different scales. What happens at the regional level and what happens at the global level. At the regional level, of course, as I mentioned earlier, Kashmir has to be centered because it is already at the center of this major conflict that is brewing up. As you said, there's been a recent report by American scientists which basically argued that any small war in the region could quickly go out of control and cause millions of deaths around the world, and potentially destroy the planet. We're thinking here of how these scales are connected. So a solution has to be sought where maybe an international agreement between a trilateral agreement between India, Pakistan, Kashmiris can emerge, where Kashmir, instead of becoming this bone of contention between India and Pakistan, becomes like a bridge of peace, where India and Pakistan agree to give freedom to the respective regions and create open borders, use Kashmir as a trade route. Kashmir is also at the heart of Central and South Asia. So those things can happen at the regional level. Locally, of course, Indian government really needs to open up the communications, free political prisoners, and basically remove military from the civilian areas as urgently as possible, because it's a unfolding humanitarian disaster. Now, globally, of course, we are seeing the rise of this populist nationalism at a time of extreme inequality. We have to. I mean, it's not only happening in India. It's happening in the U.S. It's happening in Britain. It's happening in Turkey. It's happening all over the world, and we need to kind of return to the democratic ideals. We need to make our institutions much more representative of people's interests rather than of a space where these crony capitalists can twist policies that benefit only them. I mean, much of the ground forces of RSS, the stormtroopers of RSS, actually come from low income, lower caste communities who feel like they because they have this right to inflict violence over Muslims and other minority communities, they are somehow they feel a sense of empowerment. But it's not, because they are still grinding under the feet of casteism and capitalism in these regions. So we have to take a kind of like a holistic approach to all of this, within which a new system has to be built where human rights, people's rights can be center of our focus, and economic justice can be center of our focus.
Absolutely. And it really is. I mean, that is like precisely a global pattern in terms of the dynamic you just described there. Professor Mohamad Junaid, professor of anthropology at the Massachusetts College of Liberal Arts, I really, really appreciate your time. Thank you for leading us through this.
Thank you. So nice talking to you.
Take good care.